We've heard the talk for years that it's time for a second American Revolution, and sometimes people get whipped into a frenzy supporting it. They get their 1776 flags out. They, start hyping up their crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, and it's time, guys. It's time. That's what we've heard for years and years and years. Today, we're going to be addressing some of these calls for a second American Revolution, or God forbid, people talk about things like a civil war. And I might have a take on this that's going to offend those crazy uncles that have gotten all whipped into a frenzy on Thanksgiving. I ask you the decency of listening to my entire take before you freak out in either direction. We will be discussing that. We'll also be discussing a little bit the controversy that has blown up online surrounding OnlyFans models, these online, kind of like virtual prostitutes, basically, who leave that life or nominally leave that life. They tell everybody that they're no longer going to be doing that and they've turned to Jesus Christ, and they get a lot of flack for it. And again, this is going to be a take that I have that I think is actually going to irritate some people in the red pill world, and it's going to irritate some people, but I'm heavy on grace in those situations, and I would rather be made to look a fool by welcoming 1,000 false converts, 1,000 grifters, than to burn one legitimate new believer. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit as well. Maybe the need for prepping. I mean, after all, we're going to be discussing a very serious, a very heavy topic, and that is calls for a second revolution. We'll also hopefully have a little time to discuss dissimilar cultures colliding, some stuff, maybe the filibuster. There's a lot that we can talk about today. My name is Victor Nieves. You're listening to the Victor Nieves Show. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put time stamps in the description. For anybody else, just stick around through the whole thing. So before we jump in today, I want to start off the best way I know how. That's by taking just a second to give glory and honor to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for the tremendous, the unearned, the undeserved blessings that I have enjoyed, and to pray for our nation. It really does need it, especially as we enter into this conversation surrounding, these calls that have been made, in some cases very publicly, in some cases a little bit more privately, for the need of a revolution. God be with our nation. That would be the worst thing possible. And let's jump in with it right now. I'll give a very quick disclaimer for anybody who's crazy, for any of the feds that might be watching or something like that. I do not call for violence at all. My position is that no, right now is not time for a second revolution. I think that people who are very flippant with that call need to really calm down, and they need to be prudent, and they need to think about what it is exactly that they're saying. I'll talk about in pretty good depth. It's not to say that our nation is not, our government, I should say, is not in some ways tyrannical, that we're not mirroring some of the issues that our founding fathers saw. But we often hear this talk, people who maybe didn't pay that much attention, or maybe it's just for funsies. I mean, I've probably been guilty of it myself at some point. But people who might not have paid attention in history class will say things like, well, the founding fathers fought a war over a tiny little tea tax. It was like 3 pence per imported, pound of tea or whatever it was, some tiny, tiny, minuscule tea tax. And they'll say, well, our founding fathers fought a war over a tea tax. And here we are, paying 20 or 30, in some cases even more, 40%, 50% of our income in state and federal taxes. And they'll say, surely our founding fathers would be shooting by now. And maybe there's a case to be made for that. But we have to understand that the circumstances are actually quite different. Not to say that we're not heading in the wrong direction, because we are. But we need to be very careful. So I'll start off with the disclaimer and why I'm coming to this conversation in the first place, why I'm even spending breath talking about something which will inevitably make people upset at me on both ends of the spectrum here. And that is that if there was some sort of a rash, let's call it a rash decision, and a bunch of people get hot heads and they decide now is the time for a revolution, it would turn into a civil war. We live in very different times. Militaristically, we live in different times, which is just to say that the warfare would be very brutal. We could have bombs dropped on American cities, American against American, Civil War style situation where your neighbor that you've always thought was just a normal, reasonable person ends up shooting into your house one night, or you end up attacking, fighting for food, even people that wouldn't be combatants. Civil wars are like the most horrible thing ever. There's been places, people who are alive today who have experienced civil war. If you speak to any of those people, I assure you, they'll tell you to avoid civil war if at all possible. That doesn't mean at all costs. Okay, there's the famous speech by Ronald Reagan. There does have to exist a line we will not cross. There has to be a price we will not pay. There is a time where revolution is justified and legitimate. The Declaration of Independence, which we'll visit here in a minute, lays out some of the grievances of our forefathers, but it also very clearly says if a government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. So yes, there is a point of no return where your government, where you can't vote your way out of this, right? I see this on Twitter. It trends around pretty often. People will say, we're not voting our way out of this, guys. If that is true, what are you proposing? And I just hope that anybody who would actually make a claim that it's time for a revolution or a civil war or anything like that, I would hope that you would do so having given it tremendous thought, and realizing that that probably means you're going to die a horrible death. Your children are going to be exposed to atrocities you couldn't imagine and quite possibly die. Your wife very well may die, brother on brother, neighbor on neighbor. The kind of thing that would happen if there was a second revolution or a civil war. People like to have this, it's a stupid mentality, actually, is what it is. It's a stupid mentality. They like to think that this would just be some easy walk in the park, it would just be the left versus the right. And we would just steamroll them all and get rid of all of the libs, and then everything would just be happy, and it would all just be great, like it's a movie or something. Like this is some kind of like a video game or something like that. And that's not to say that if there was a organized battle between left and right, I think the right would win. The left is far less armed. They can't figure out what gender they are. I understand all of like the quips and all of that stuff. Oh, they don't even know what toilet to use. How could they possibly win a war? Valid. There is truth in those jokes. But there's also truth in the fact that we're a nation of 350 million people. You know how many women and children, how many just totally uninvolved people would be caught up in such a conflict? So I'm establishing this disclaimer before we go into this conversation to say that we need to be incredibly sober-minded about how we do this. And people have very flippantly said things like, oh, it's time, we need another. Do you really understand what exactly you're advocating for? And with that disclaimer, I also want to repeat multiple times here, there is a line that we cannot cross. There's a bridge too far. And our founding fathers had this exact debate. People often think one day they just woke up in 1776 and they said, hey, I'm writing a letter to King George and we're going to break off. We're just going to leave. That's not the way that this played out. That's not the history of the American Revolution. The American people in the colonies had been self-governing for quite some time. The real thing that kind of led into the American Revolution was actually the war itself and the aftermath of the French and Indian War, because the French and Indian War lasted for quite a while, and it was very expensive. And so King George, not giving a whole history lesson here, just the cliff notes, King George had to pay a lot of money to protect the colonies. And so then he started taxing the colonies, because that's what you do when you're the king of a colonial empire. If you just had to spend a lot of money, well, you want to get your money back. And so he said, hey, I'll just loot the colonies, basically. And the colonies got very offended by this. And it was a long period of time. I mean, those wars ended in the 1760s. It wasn't until 76 where we actually had the Declaration of Independence. So you look, there's really a 20, 30-year window of the tensions building and building. They didn't just wake up one day and say, to heck with this, we're going to have a big war. The tensions built in early America, colonial America. You had things like the Stamp Act, and you had the Townshend Acts, and you had the Boston Massacre, for goodness sakes, leading up to this, brewing into the war itself. Then you have, the tea situation. You have the Intolerable Acts and the Insufferable Acts. And then, that's where we look at one of these things and we go, oh, it was just a tax on tea. No, it wasn't just a tax on tea. And the grand culmination, the thing that actually resulted in the shot heard round the world, the beginning of the American Revolution, the true beginning, predates the Declaration of Independence itself. The true beginning of the American Revolution, like the war itself, the actual fighting, happened in 1775. That was the battles of Lexington and Concord. What was the context there? Did the colonials just wake up and say, hey, we're really sick of this? We're just going to go start a fight, guys. Let's just go start a fight. No, that's not the way that it happened. What actually happened is that the Crown, sensing the tensions that were building, I mean, they weren't stupid people either. They might have done stupid things, but they could kind of have their finger on the pulse. The Boston Massacre did not exactly get very much fanfare from their subjects in the colonies. They decided a good idea would be to take the guns. And so Lexington and Concord, we've talked about this here on the show in the past, Lexington and Concord were where munitions depots were. It's where they kept a bunch of gunpowder and ammo and guns and all of that kind of stuff. The Crown said, we're going to go take them. That's the British are coming, all of this history that we learn, in 4th or 5th grade American history class, they were coming to take the guns, literal confiscation of the colonial method of defense. Okay, so when we're talking about the scale of tyranny, it's not to say that it was, they taxed my tea. It's that they were massacring people. They were literally killing people in the street, like the Boston Massacre. They were literally in the process of physically, actually, straight up, totally disarming the people, taxing them, of course, without representation. That was one of the big pieces of the puzzle. I don't dispute that, but it's an entire pie. There's a large number of things that went into it. The build up to the American Revolution. And yes, we are seeing a polarization in this country. We are seeing government tyranny. We're seeing things that expand beyond the legitimate purview of the federal government in excess of what the Constitution lays out for it. Those are bad things, and they're great causes for concern. But let's take a look here in a second at what the actual Declaration of Independence said and some of the grievances that they had at that time. So let's look at the Declaration. What were the legitimate grievances that were put, pen to paper? Some of this is in Old English, so it's a little bit confusing. But let's just jump right into it. Thomas Jefferson writing for, on behalf of the colonies. He says the first one, that the King George, has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. So he's not letting them govern. He's not letting his governors, actually do the thing that they're supposed to be doing. This is kind of a confiscation of power in a way. He refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people. We're kind of similarly, seeing a theme here, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature. So again, this accumulation of power, taking it away from the people, becoming more and more of a tyrant in the lives of the people in the colonies. They continue and say, he has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. That one's kind of self-explanatory. He's putting all sorts of hoops, and we might view this as like bureaucratic nonsense that they would try and do to disconnect the people from any form of representation. And we're seeing, and by the way, as we go through these, and I think it's really important that Americans read the Declaration of Independence and the particulars that are outlined in it, the specific grievances, and then compare what's happening. Because our government, now I don't want anybody to get me wrong on this, our government is doing things that it ought not do. There is no question about that, and I understand why this conversation is being had. I'm just trying to temper some of the emotions, and hopefully we have people with level heads that think these things through very closely. But as we look at some of these, yes, there are parallels. There are clear and obvious parallels. The federal government is not doing it to this degree, but we're seeing them strip away states' rights, the legitimate powers of the states, confusing things with the bureaucracy, moving the representation of the people from its legitimate place to Washington, D.C. in a way that was not intended. That's not the correct balance of a federal system of government. But let's continue. It says he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of peoples. So what had happened here is, as it says, basically, you had these legislative bodies of the people, right? This is representative government in the colonies. They had established this themselves, and the king had come in and said, no, I'm just going to disband that. You don't get to do that because you're disagreeing with me. You with manliness, you firmly, disagree with what the crown is saying, so I'm just going to completely remove an entire legislative body. This is a splinter away. We have not seen this. We have not seen a president, we've not seen Congress removing state-level authority, like literally removing the body, right? Imagine if you're, say, in Missouri, the federal government goes to Jeff City and just says, hey, you guys all got to leave this building. We're not doing the whole legislative thing at the state level anymore. I'm disbanding the representative houses. We have not yet seen that, though we've seen maybe a bureaucratic form of it for a while. They continue, he's refused for a long time after such disillusions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable with annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all of the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage the migrants hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. So this is a bit convoluted. Again, some of this being in Old English, a little bit harder to understand. We're dealing with colonies that needed people. He's making it very difficult for that to happen. Obstructed administration of justice. He's made judges dependent upon his will alone. It's a really bad thing. We've seen a Democrat effort to do this. We've seen discussion of stacking the courts, things of that nature, but we've not yet seen anybody straight up make judges dependent upon their will alone. There's still at least the image, I guess, that they're adhering to the Constitution. But we see this. We see these themes being repeated, though not yet to the degree that they were at that time. Erected new offices, so he's literally creating new government positions to harass people. That's literally what they say. Eat out of their substance, harass our people, and eat out of their substance. He's kept among us. This is continuing on in the Declaration of Independence with the grievances of our forefathers. The king has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. So this is obviously a threat. This is what led up, by the way, to the Boston Massacre. All of these armed troops imposing very clearly. There's an obvious message being sent by the crown, by storing these people. That's, by the way, that is why we have, the Third Amendment to the United States Constitution. There can be no quartering of troops. The reason is in the Declaration. We had already dealt with that. Continuing on, he effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He's combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. So he's imposing their laws on them. This is kind of like no representation. You're being legislated upon in a tyrannical form. He's cut off our trade with parts of the world. He's imposed taxes on us without our consent. He's deprived us of the benefits of trial by jury. He's transporting, the Americans across the ocean to be tried for their offenses rather than having a jury of their peers. So you can see, by the way, some of the, again, going back to the Third Amendment, now we see some of the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments being represented here in the grievances originally. We can see what was going on. And the list of these complaints continues and continues. Plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. These are big, big allegations. He's abdicated government here, declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. The crown had done, I don't want to bore you with a big history lesson here, but if we look through the grievances of the Declaration of Independence, we are in types and shadows of that right now. We are experiencing lesser degrees of it, but we're not experiencing it to the degree that the American founding fathers experienced it. Revolution is a horrible thing that should be avoided if at all possible. Again, not at all costs, if at all possible. And so I have limited patience for the people who jump up and down screaming and chanting about how we need to go to a revolution, we need to go to war. Could you write out your grievances? For real, I think that's actually a good idea. It might be a healthy practice for Americans to do on occasion. Literally sit down like Thomas Jefferson did. Write down your grievances. Find the 5 worst things. And I'm not downplaying them. I'm not saying that these are not significant. Find the 5 worst grievances, look at them, and say, okay, what is my plausible course of action to correct this? Are there other steps? Are there things that you could do shy of a revolution? Are there things that you could do shy of violence and burning down the American system and having brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor and this internal civil war, which would be the worst thing you could possibly imagine in your entire life? Are there steps between what you've done right now and revolution? The answer is yes. I promise you, the answer is yes. If every single American had exhausted all of the things that we could do between here and there, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. We're in the position that we're in as a nation, not because of our lack of, will to have some sort of a war. I mean, the revolutionary spirit is still alive and well in the United States, and that is a good thing, by the way. That is a good thing. But we're in the place that we're in because we, the people, have not exhausted our options. We haven't even participated in the process. We have so many Americans who do not vote, so many conservatives who don't even show up in the primaries. You get mad about your general election, options, but you didn't vote in the primary. You didn't even cast a vote whenever it came to that. People are not knocking doors. They're not participating in campaigns. I'm talking the bare minimum, the very basics. Listen, if you're not willing to go knock on doors to support a candidate that you want to see in office, brother, you're not going to make it in a civil war, okay? This is a reality check, a little cold water to the face. People are jumping up and down. You don't want that option because you weren't willing to knock on doors, man. You weren't willing to do phone banks. You're not willing to go and donate a little bit of money to a campaign or to a cause that you believe in. If that's you, and there's plenty of, I know I have listeners who have been very involved in the political process. My hat's off to you. I have as well. I've knocked thousands of doors. I've spent tons of time working on campaign. Still not enough. It's for me, I couldn't look at what I've done and say, oh yeah, the only thing left to do is to have a bloody, violent revolution that destroys my family and the, future of my children in the immediate. That's not the way. You have to exhaust everything before you do something stupid. Before we wrap up our conversation surrounding these calls for a second revolution that have been going on for the last 15 or so years, I want to mention one more thing, and that is the Christian obligation to not jump into these sorts of things. The Bible has some very uncomfortable, and I won't do a whole Bible study here with you, but I encourage you to look into it. The Bible has some very, at times, uncomfortable teaching about submitting to authority. We see, in the New Testament, that it's taught very clearly that God does establish rulers over men, and that there is a place for us to yield to the legitimate authority above us. Now, we also see in the Bible examples like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that make very clear when the law of man is in opposition with the law of God, we have to side with the law of God. But there's a lot of gray area outside of that. Jesus even told his disciples to render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's at a time where Caesar was not so great. Okay, so Jesus didn't come and say, hey, bloody revolution right here, right now. As Christians, we ought to really, really be in the Word of God. If you're a Christian and you're jumping up and down and you're excited and you post internet memes on Twitter and stuff like that, I hate to be the Debbie Downer, I hate to be the wet blanket here, but as a Christian, the justification for war is hard to find. It's not to say that it does not exist, because it does. There is such thing as just war theory. I 100% believe in it. We see all throughout the Old Testament. There's a lot of just war. I'm not against the warrior, okay? What I'm saying is you have to have a darn good, because not only will you answer in this life, not only will there be earthly consequences should you go and try and pop off and do something stupid, not only are those legitimate consequences, you will stand before your maker, and if you go and do something crazy, you better have a good explanation for it. You better be able to explain why you went and bucked the system and fought the government. And again, there is a world where that is good. I believe the American founding, the American Revolution, was a very good thing, and they balanced this very well. They did everything that they could before going to war. They didn't want to go to war. They pled with the king. They did everything that they could. It wasn't until war came to them, actually, when there was an actual confiscation of firearms. So for anybody who thinks I'm like limp-wristed and soft on this kind of stuff, when there's a legitimate confiscation of firearms from my cold, dead hands, that has to be a line in the sand. There do have to exist legitimate lines in the sand where we say, no, we're not going to let the government round us up and take us to some re-education camp, okay? There are legitimate lines of demarcation. You cannot cross that Rubicon without a violent resistance to tyranny. Resistant to tyrants, what's the great quote? Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. Fantastic quote, and I do believe that that is true. But at the same time, you waking up one day and deciding that you don't like your local municipal tax and deciding that you're going to go make a killdozer or something and try and drive... We can make memes about it, we can joke about things like this, and we can love the American revolutionary spirit, which keeps the government in check, and we should keep that alive. We also have to have level-headed, sober, reasonable voices who say, I hear you, and there is a time and a place, but you got to answer to your maker for that. And if you look historically, the American Revolution is like one of the only examples ever where a revolution was done, I believe, in accordance with true Christian principles and having exhausted every other method with legitimate leadership, good Christian leadership, not just people burning things down willy-nilly and everybody going guerrilla warfare, but legitimate Christian leadership. You had the Continental Congress, you had George Washington, you had these people who were devout, they were sincere, they were genuine, good faith people. They weren't trying to burn something to, down and recreate it in their own image. They were trying to do something genuinely for the good of themselves, their posterity, their people, etc. That's a rarity. Not long after the American Revolution, we saw the French Revolution. Just because there's tyranny doesn't mean the way that you respond to tyranny is going to be any better. Okay, the French Revolution, historically, we always hear the accounts. There was blood flowing through the street. It's obviously a little bit dramatized, but blood flowing through the streets, and it was like knee deep because they were executing so many people. They got so mad, they just started butchering everybody. The French Revolution was horrible. It didn't turn out good. There wasn't some sort of a beneficial consequence thereafter. It was awful. It was a bloody, horrible mess. That's an example of what typically happens in a revolution. It was a godless and hedonistic revolution from the top down. Like there was no leadership. It was just butchering. They were just going to go butcher everybody. That is a terrible, terrible thing. So this is a serious topic, and I try to be prudent about it. Again, I'll close on this chapter with restating my disclaimer. I am against violence. I am against war. That does not mean that there is not a time and a place where it is appropriate. There is such a thing as just war theory. We should keep an eye on our government. We should maintain the revolutionary spirit. We have to answer to God, though. Okay, we have to answer to God, and we have to understand the consequences of our actions. Don't let the memes get to your head. Don't let the internet stuff and 1776 in the gap. Listen, I'm a 1776 guy. I used to sell, way back in the day, I sold a t-shirt that said 1776 foreign and domestic was underlined. So I'm in agreement with the spirit and the frustration and I'm very dissatisfied when I see many of the things that my government does, from the federal level to the state level to all over the place. We have corruption, we have evil, we have all of these things. Until we have exhausted every single avenue possible, do not subject your family, your wife, your children to the horrors that would be an American Civil War. All right, now let's on that note, let's move on here just a little bit. I want to talk about the need. I'm not going to be super long-winded with this. I used to discuss it a lot more often, and no, I have not picked up a sponsor with I don't know, one of these food preparedness companies or anything like that. Though I I do believe in that, so I would probably take one. But I think you should be a prepper and not a weirdo. I'm not saying like one of those people who had the early 2000s History Channel TV shows about them where it's like, this is my 75th underground bunker, and these are my, this is my recreation of a Sherman tank, and they have all of these like ridiculous, they do some of that stuff, by the way, to dissuade people. Like they like to put on television people who are like, I don't know, kind of look like they're on our team, similar enough, but are really weird. Like, you ever notice that, like with Christians in mainstream media, the Christians are always the ones that are jerks. The Christians are always the ones that are like super hypocritical. They take someone that is quote unquote representative of our people, and then they just put them out there as a laughing stock to dissuade people, like normal people, from joining our ranks. That's a whole thing. It's my conspiracy on it, I guess. But they do that with the preppers as well. They're like, oh, when you think of a prepper, you think of these shows that used to be on TV where it's some just like obese guy who's like, I have 7,000 toilets. I have 7,000 toilets in my underground bunker in case one of the toilets breaks. And it's like, okay, that guy is a freak. I'm not saying that you should be like that. I'm saying, and I'm particularly talking to the men here as a man with my own family now and other human beings to look after and take care of. I used to talk about this more often, just kind of faded out of my thought, just life goes on and things like that. But COVID was a big wake-up call for a lot of people. You should be prepping. And this is something I've always believed in. You look at your grandparents, for example, taking it away from the weird guy you saw on HGTV or you saw on, I don't know, one of these other, like a tabloid or something like that. Your grandparents probably had experienced hard times. They maybe came from the generation of the Great Depression or a few generations after that where there was still a lot of the weight of the Great Depression. They kept their own tools. The men knew how to work on their cars. They knew how to repair things. They knew how to, fix stuff if there was no one coming to help them. If they couldn't afford to have somebody come to help them, the men had to figure it out. Maybe they didn't always do it the right way. I joke, my grandfather, who is one of the greatest men I've ever had the privilege of meeting. My grandfather could fix anything. He might not fix it right. That might have been the question. Like if you had a real professional come look at it, they might say, that's not supposed to be this way, but I guess it is work. It does technically work. He could fix just about anything. And that was a whole generation of men. There was a whole generation of men that just had to make things work. They had to figure it out. They were smart people. They were prepared. They had guns. They had ammunition. They shot those guns. They trained with those guns, at least to some degree. They worked with their hands. They were familiar with the tools that they had. The women knew how to cook and store things. They had canned vegetables. They had cellars with extra food for the winter, for hard times. They would have bags of rice or beans or whatever it might be because they had lived through it. They knew that sometimes in life supply chains break. We as a people have become so incredibly dependent upon a very new system. All throughout human history, what we're living in is very weird. It's very rare. It's very strange that all of the food that you consume is created and provided to you by somebody else. Everything that you enjoy, like so much in our lives, is literally the product of somebody else, and we have no idea how to do it. Many men right now can't change the oil in their car, and it's not hard. It's not a big flex if you know how to do it, but it's just you couldn't do the work on your car if you needed to, change a tire if you needed to. You just pay somebody to come do it. Well, what if you no longer have the funds to do it? What if it's your wife's car, and you guys literally cannot make ends meet? What if you can't find food? What if the farms are not there, or what if you just can't afford it? Who knows what the circumstance could be? A supply chain break. We're seeing like little flirting with this in a way in the Strait of Hormuz with the war in Iran. There's a lot of products, even fertilizer goes through. There's a huge percentage of the world's fertilizer that travels through the Strait of Hormuz. People are freaking out about farms because if the farms can't get the fertilizers, the crop's not going to grow correctly, and then we're not going to get the correct distribution of the yield. And so it could be a situation. I'm not saying this to scare people. I'm not saying this is going to happen right now in the immediate, but it could be a situation where at some point in our lifetime, you need food for 6 months or something as we try and fix the grid. Or God forbid, you need food for 6 months and then it's never coming back and you need to know how to hunt and gather and learn to do this stuff. Basic preparation when times are good will decide whether or not your family lives or dies. And that's a scary thing, but it's the responsibility of men. And again, you don't need to be weird about it. You don't have to make it your personality, and everywhere you go, you have to show everybody your garden and all. And like, that's awesome. Like, by the way, if you're one of those people, I would appreciate that. I would think that I'm impressed by the people who are super crunchy. They have their own food. They make their own butter, all of that stuff. You're my people, okay? But not everybody's like that. And I'm not asking everyone to be like that. I'm not saying that as a individual, you need to just go all or nothing into this. But how much food do you have in your pantry right now? Do you have 2 weeks of food? Do you have 2 months of food? Most people would be shocked if the grocery store shelves went away. You'd be shocked how quickly you starve to death. You'd be shocked how quickly you run out of the essentials that you need. We kind of had like a test run with this with COVID. It never even really happened, though. We had the fear of a supply chain break, and it barely happened with toilet paper. Like, that's the least. In the whole big scheme of things, toilet paper is kind of the least of your concerns. Okay, you can get a leaf. You can't. Food is a little bit more important than toilet paper, We never even really had a supply chain break with COVID, but we had the fear of it, the hysteria of it, which is what caused the panic buy, which is really why you couldn't buy toilet paper, is because everybody thought they were going to run out of toilet paper, so they had to go and buy it right then, right there. That was with one particular tiny piece of, and it was short-lived. Imagine a real supply chain break where Walmart straight up stops getting load. They stop getting shipments in. They no longer can replenish the beans on the shelf or the meat in the coolers. Do you have any concept of what you would do? Have you ever thought about that? As a man, the head of your household, you should think this through, at least to some degree. 20 minutes of thought could make the world of difference. Having a little bit of stuff, whether it's rice and some beans. Man, you can live a long time. Might not enjoy it. You could live a long time on rice and beans before you starve to death. Supplement it with a little bit of fish and meat and whatever it would be. Get some canned stuff. There's all sorts, like this is not an advertisement for anybody. There's a million brands, like My Patriot Supply this and My this and My that sell the food, but you don't have to buy it. That stuff can be expensive. You can make your own. Do you have guns? Do you have ammunition? I always laugh, and in the gun world, we see, some of the older generations believe themselves to be incredibly well prepared because they have 55 rifles and they have a bunch of ammo in various calibers. But the problem is they haven't trained with any of it. They can't run an 8-minute mile. They don't know how to clean, strip, work on any of their firearms. They don't even, some of them aren't zeroed. They don't have optics on them. They don't have a sling on them. And you have 50 different guns in 50 different calibers, if that's even possible. And you only have a little bit of ammo for each. You're better off having one rifle with a real kit, with a chest rig that you can get for $50 from military surplus or something, with a real first aid, with some of that stuff, and, a dozen mags or something with some green tips in them. You're better to have that than you are to have 50. Just think about these things, okay? This is my request. I don't have any inside knowledge. I'm not a doomsday guy, but we've gotten away from that, and it's a really bad thing. Well, my friend, we are now in the fourth and final segment of today's show. I don't know where all of the time went, but it absolutely flew by. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. It's brought to you by you. If you didn't know that, we're doing this because we love the cause. And so if you enjoy the show, you are the sponsor of the show. Share it with somebody, a friend, a family member. If you watch it on YouTube, share it, subscribe, do all of this stuff. Leave a comment. It helps a lot. Leave a like, whatever it would be. Get this to people. If you think that this is valuable information, I think that that's why we do the show in the first place. Do me a solid and share the show as best as you possibly can. Now, let's talk really quickly. I mentioned a couple of things at the beginning of the show. I think that we've gotten through the vast majority of them. I do want to touch on the controversy surrounding OF models, because I mentioned that, and it really is, it's something that has bothered me a little bit. And it's tricky, and I wanted to be able to unpack it a little bit more. I made a post about this on social media, and as I said at the beginning of the show today, I would rather be made to look a fool 1,000 times. I would rather 1,000 lying grifters who are just so-called converting to Christianity because they want to get money, they want to get a check, they want to find a new way to get attention. I would rather welcome 1,000 of them and be made to look like an idiot 1,000 times than to reject just one who is legitimately giving their life to the Lord and has not yet figured out, hey, there's some things, maybe some best practices. I see these people, whether I think the most famous was Nala Ray, probably. There's been a few more. I saw some pop up on my timeline. And it's people who are really mad because these young women are very publicly turning to Christ, and they're getting baptized. They're wearing cross necklaces. And I understand the concern because I see it both ways. I do see the damage that is done by those grifters. I do see that if we make them somehow like the icon of Christianity, it can be very misleading to people, especially if there's not a heart of repentance. If there is no fruit of the Spirit, it can give a very bad understanding. One of the biggest reasons, let me say it this way, one of the biggest reasons people turn away from Christianity is because of Christians and because of the bad example that Christians set. And so we are all a bad example. I give the hypothetical or the comparison to money, right? If you're looking to judge Christianity, please don't use me as the example of Christianity. As much as I would love to be a great example of it, I'm simply not going to be the best copy of what Jesus did here on earth. Sanctification takes a lifetime. In the same way, there's a lot of money out there. Some of it is real, some of it is not. Don't judge the US dollar based on a counterfeit, based on a copy, based on something that's trying to get as close to the genuine as it possibly can. Base Christianity off the real deal, which would be Jesus. Jesus is the true currency. Christians are people trying to emulate it. So we're not perfect. Hopefully we get as close as we can. We're human beings, though. In the same way, Christians, it's like we see a lot of the counterfeits out there. We say, well, you're not really a Christian. That's a hard thing to make that call on, but that's why people leave, is because we have bad counterfeits out there running around under the name of Christianity. So I do appreciate and understand the damage that could be done. And I don't want to minimize that because I think it's a legitimate concern. I just also see the tremendous damage that can be done when we try to downplay, or maybe not even intentionally, but when we effectively downplay the significance of the gospel, of the redemptive power of Jesus Christ. I don't care if you were a prostitute for 60 years. I don't care if you're a murderer or a tax collector. Jesus didn't care either, in the sense that he died for you still the same. Okay, he doesn't want you. He cares in the sense that he doesn't want you to continue in sin. That would be, if he wanted you to continue in sin, he wouldn't be caring for you. He cares enough for you, for him to want what's best for you, which would be to stop sinning. And it is evil. God hates sin. That is true. God legitimately hates sin. So he definitely cares, but he died for you all the same. He loves you all the same. The gospel is the same for you. He was on the cross for you, regardless of if you were a prostitute or anything like that. And whatever you've done, you're not too far gone. The cross is sufficient for what you've done, and that is true of these OnlyFans models as well. When they legitimately come to Christ and they change, they repent, they change their direction, and they're now oriented toward Jesus, the cross is sufficient for them. And when we reject them so wholeheartedly, so thoroughly, and at face value, it says to other people who might have done the same things, who might be grotesque sinners, just like me and just like you. Let's not forget that we are wretched sinners saved by grace, not by our own good works, but by what Jesus did. It communicates to people who have not yet accepted Christ that the gospel is not sufficient for them. If God can't save Nala or these OnlyFans girls or whatever it is, then how could God save me? Right? If all of these Christians are saying, no, that former OnlyFans person can't possibly be a Christian, then I surely can't be a Christian either. I'm too far gone. If I tried to go into that church, the building would burn. No, I'm here to tell you that is not the case. And yes, we can use a level of discernment, but all of this isn't it can be on a scale to a degree. We can be reasonable. If somebody says that they're a Christian, they do this big publicity, because this does happen, right? We've seen this, and we have been burned. We can use our discernment, and we can say, hey, this OF person is saying that they're a Christian now, but they're still making, illicit content. They're still what if they're just doing this as some sort of a grift to bring attention to their prostitution? Well, then, yeah, we can use our discernment and we can say we judge by the fruits, and the odds are that person is not genuine in this. There's been no repentance. There's been no turning in orientation, but they're still going to get stuff wrong, right? So we have to be balanced in our discernment. and understand that salvation is instant. Sanctification is a lifetime. You and I are still figuring out how to be sanctified. We are still in the process of trying to become more like Christ, and that'll continue until the day that we die. When you have somebody who's lived a life of sin for their last 20 years, and they've been so thoroughly in it, and then they come to Christ, day one as a new believer, they're not going to have everything figured out. They may not realize, okay, now's probably a good time for me to step away from social media. And that is my recommendation, by the way. If you're somebody who is an OF person, an OnlyFans, an online prostitute, whatever it is, if that's you and you have a big platform, there's nothing wrong with telling everybody about your conversion to Christ. That's sharing the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he can save somebody like you, he can save anybody. But it's also a good time probably to step away from the internet for a little while. Focus on repentance. Focus on your church family. Focus on your relationship with the Lord and getting a good foundation before you turn into what you think is the next Billy Graham, if that makes sense. And that's for you. It's also for everybody else, because you want to be a good representative of the faith. And on day one, it's very difficult to do that. I'm very cautious as somebody who's a lifetime Christian. I'm very cautious when I speak. I don't want to get something wrong, right? I don't want to promote heresy. I don't want to say something or speak on behalf of the Lord and be wrong about something. So it's high stakes poker in a way, if you understand what I'm saying. So I think it's a good and appropriate thing for these people to step away from the internet, to step away from the limelight, and focus on the repentance. But they also have a great platform that God can use to reach other people. So that's my take on it. I understand I probably am going to welcome people who are not legitimate. But again, I'll say I would rather welcome 1,000 liars, 1,000 grifters, 1,000 people who are being dishonest than reject just one genuine new believer. Imagine how crushing that would be for a new believer. You've left this life of sin. You announce it to the world, and you get spat on by other Christians. Don't be that guy. Don't be that one, because listen, you deserve hell. Just like them. Now, I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, every single sin is all the same. All sin is equal in the sense that it separates us from God, and the just punishment for that sin is hell. That is true. That is 100% biblical. But it's also true that there are sins that God particularly hates, okay? We see that God hates pride, as an example. God literally hates pride. God hates the hands that shed innocent blood, okay? There are certain sins that are more significant of a violation than others. The all sin is created equal statement is just to say that all violations have the punishment of separation from the justice of God, the mercy, the love of God. That would be, I don't want to say the mercy and the justice. That's not a correct way to say that. See, there's an example. But either way, what I was talking about, I don't want to misrepresent what the Bible says. I encourage everybody. I'm not a pastor. Do your own reading of the word. But separation, right? When we sin, the just punishment would be hell. God is a just God. That's why we have Jesus. I get into the whole story of the gospel for you there. But anyway, I understand all of that. But as you have a judgmental mindset toward people, remember that was you too. That's what I'm trying to get at, is that was you too. You were deserving of eternal separation from Christ, just like them. Don't get prideful. Don't get boastful in your salvation. That was a work of the Lord, okay? Anyway, we only have a minute left here today. I saw a video of some people cooking guinea pigs in New York City. Dissimilar cultures, when they collide, do not always work out well. Some cultures are legitimately better than others. It's just true. If you have a culture that eats people's pets, that's not a good culture. I don't like that culture. If you have a culture that's in favor of euthanasia, I don't like that culture. There's all sorts of different cultures that dance with dead people in Africa. They dig up their bones and they dance with them. Yeah, that's not an equal culture to the culture that was created on Christian ethics and Western values. When we have people that are coming from these dissimilar places, they need to assimilate or just not come. Maybe they just don't come here. If you're going to try and cook guinea pigs in the street in New York City, yeah, I'm not on that team, man. I'm not on that team. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I appreciate you, and I appreciate sticking with me through this show and holding your judgments till the end. I appreciate it. Anyways, till next time, keep me in your prayers. Keep your country in your prayers. God bless.